I call Carol Beaumont.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I rise also to speak in support of the Airports Cost Recovery for Processing of International Travellers Bill. And before the Honourable Maurice Williamson it doesn't get a chance to hear this, can I just give him a wee correction as well? My colleague is Sua Williamsio. So I draw that to his attention in a constructive manner. Now, as I was saying, this is a bill that we support, introduced by David Carter in his biosecurity portfolio. And as the previous speaker, the Honourable Maurice Williamson, has outlined, this is really a sensible provision, a provision that looks at the cost of providing customs and biosecurity services to new international airports, and also to looking at those that basically close down and then start up again, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But basically, these are significant services required to be provided at international airports, and there is significant cost associated with them. Now, from our position, we support the bill, as I've said, and we have to seriously invest in services which protect our country from invasive foreign pests. And that's very important given the nature of our economy, and I'll talk a little more on that shortly. And so new international airports clearly place a significant added burden and require additional investment in biosecurity and customs services, and those airports should be a part of the cost of that significant investment. Now, from our perspective, this requirement to provide some sort of cost recovery, though, needs to be balanced against the economic development interests of the regions in which the new international airports may service. The example given previously was the potential for Timaru International Airport. I personally can't see that happening anytime soon, but should that be the case, then the economic development interests would clearly be there. So, in looking at this bill in a little more detail, essentially providing for, as I've said, cost recovery of aviation security, biosecurity and customs traveller processing in relation to scheduled international flights arriving at or departing from new or re-established international airports, and international flights where on request travellers are processed in a non-routine manner at any international airport. So it could be an existing one but outside of the normal schedule. Now, the objective is to reduce the government's exposure to an unpredictable or unlimited liability in relation to the processing of travellers. Now, we looked at this issue ourselves in 2004, as has been mentioned, and Labor consulted and discussed this matter widely with regional councils and businesses, and we chose at that time to reduce the cost recovery period for providing customs and biosecurity services to just 1 year. And we were concerned that a longer period would have issues around economic development for regions. Since that time, both Rotorua and Invercargill have established international airports, and they've removed two of the primary objectives, in fact, to the policy. So we think probably the bill goes too far in proposing a 3-year cost recovery period, and 2 years perhaps might be a fairer balance, and we're keen to discuss that balance in Select Committee. So as you can see, I'm sure this is going to be a very constructive discussion. We're basically on the same page here, and it's around the detail. As I said, we put considerable effort when we were looking at this into consulting the public. There was a discussion document. There were a number of objections raised, which the government of the time, the Labor government, listened to and responded. And the difference between this is this has been not well signalled. There's been no consultation. In fact, I believe not even a press release heralding the arrival of this bill. However, it is fair that new international airports should pay their fair share of the cost of customs and biosecurity arrangements. And as I said earlier, the issue of biosecurity is probably one of the most significant economic issues for this country. Given our dependence on our primary industries, getting it right in terms of biosecurity is absolutely fundamental. We could devastate entire industries and huge earnings for our country by making mistakes in that space. And can I say that prior to coming into Parliament, I was a member of the previous government's Food and Beverage Task Force, and that task force looked very closely at a number of areas related to this, because food and beverage is a significant part of our economy, is always going to be, in my opinion, because it is something we do have a natural advantage at, and despite our distance from many of our markets, we do it remarkably well. But we must have really strong regulation and support in areas like biosecurity. And it's interesting to me that it's one of the few areas of regulation that you can talk about and everybody agrees. You know, even all those people that say, oh, we shouldn't have too much regulation and get rid of all the red tape, they know that in terms of biosecurity that isn't the case. And I also just would note that I did my Business Parliament Trust placement with Assure Quality and was very impressed by the work that they do and others that work in the biosecurity area. They're dedicated to this cause and dedicated to securing the place of our primary industries in our economy. So I'd just like to acknowledge their work. Now, of course, we were very concerned last year when 54 staff from New Zealand Biosecurity were cut. We think that's very, very foolish, and those cuts should be reversed. These are frontline positions, and this is a government over there that talks a lot about back office and frontline and all of that. These were frontline positions that were vital to protecting our country against foreign pests and organisms which could wreak economic and environmental havoc. And I say again, this is the viability of our country. Our economy is very, very dependent on our primary industry. So I'd urge the government to look at that issue, to reconsider 54 staff and the relative cost of that compared to things like the $10 billion cost that foot and mouth would incur if it ever took hold in New Zealand. So I hope that's something that we can get some agreement on across the House in the spirit of cooperation around this important issue of biosecurity. Now, the main provisions of the bill: cost recovery at new and re-established international airports. Charges for processing of travellers will be specified in regulation, and it will specify the costs that may be recovered and the methods of charging, as well as the limit of the time period for cost recovery. At the moment it's talking about, as I said earlier, a maximum of 3 years with a lesser period able to be prescribed by regulation, and I think that will be quite a lively discussion at the Select Committee. So we should take account of the submissions, obviously, that are made on that issue about the appropriate period of time for cost recovery to apply. At the expiry of that cost recovery period, the cost of aviation security services will continue to be recovered, but the charges will fall then directly on the airline, and biosecurity and customs services will be funded by the government after that cost recovery time period. So I think that's a recognition there of the private and public good aspects that are in place with things like aviation security, biosecurity and customs. Now, there is a grace period for re-establishing international airports, and that allows an airport company to find a replacement airline within a reasonable time, during which the processing services could remain in place, and that is important. So you may have an international airport, just for example, let's say Rotorua, where for some reason the carrier, which probably unlikely because I'm not sure, but I assume the international services out of there are Air New Zealand, but let's for argument's sake say that they decided to vacate that spot, then clearly there would be a strong desire to get another airline in place, and so that grace period would mean that they have the ability to do that before the cost recovery period would take place. So those are the main points I think that I'd like to draw to the House's attention. While this may not feature as potentially one of the sexiest bills to hit the House, it is fundamentally important, and I can see that the member across the House, Shane Ardern, who's a man who is very concerned about primary production, as am I, he can see the importance of this, and I commend this bill.